I have the pleasure of introducing our presenters. First, we've got John Evans. John is the founder and managing partner of Denali Group. He has 20-plus years of experience in supply chain consulting, having consulted with dozens of Fortune 500 companies in the United States, Europe, and Asia Pacific. Currently, he focuses on strategic supply chain management and has led engagements relating to supply chain and procurement transformation, strategic sourcing, supplier management and development, supply chain strategy, and logistics optimization. Marrena Anderson is the Director of Recruiting and Staffing. Marrena is a Vice President with Denali Group, providing oversight to its recruiting and staffing division and executive input across the company. She has more than 15 years of experience in talent acquisition, specifically in procurement/supply chain space and project account management. Prior to joining Denali Group, Anderson's successful engagements included BPO, RPO, and full life cycle recruiting for Fortune 500 consumer products, as well as medical devices, pharmaceutical, and automotive companies through executive search agreements. Marrena holds a bachelor's degree in business from Western Michigan and is AIRS certified in both diversity and internet recruiting. Marrena was named as a 2015 Pro to Know by Supply and Demand Chain Executive. John, please take it away.
Thanks, John, and welcome everyone. I'm John Evans with Denali Group, and we're excited to be talking to you about innovative resource models today. Before we get started, just a quick overview on Denali Group. For those of you who aren't familiar with our company, we've been around for about 20 years. We're a procurement services firm. We have a consulting division, which helps companies with strategic sourcing, category management, procurement transformation. We have Denali Sourcing Services, which provides managed services in the sourcing and category management and supplier management space. We've got delivery centers for that, 2 in the U.S. and 1 in Ireland, China, India, and Turkey. Denali Intelligence is a subscription-based market intelligence offering. We cover about 80 different spend categories and sell those on an annual subscription basis. And then we have Denali Academy that we just launched a couple of years ago that does training and development in the sourcing and category management space. We do both public workshops at our facilities as well as custom training at client sites. And also we do online training through some web interfaces that we have. And then we have Denali Recruiting and Staffing, which does search for all levels of procurement and sourcing personnel. So we've got, we cover everything from VP levels to sourcing analysts. And then we also do temp and temp to perm placement as well. So we do a lot of interesting things in the procurement and sourcing space. So with that, let's go into what we're going to cover today. As I mentioned, it's a pretty new topic for us. We actually just presented this for the first time at the New York Symposium last week. And we feel that we've got a pretty unique perspective on this because, you know, we see a lot of companies doing some pretty creative things in terms of how they're adding resources to their organization without necessarily hiring people. And we've seen, I would say, in the last 18 to 12 months, companies getting pretty creative, and we're going to share some what we see happening with all of you. But we think we've got a unique perspective because if you look at the ways that companies add resources, you know, there's staffing, there's consulting, there's managed services, and usually those are pretty competing service lines. But we're unique in that we do provide all those. So we do consulting and staffing and managed services. So I think we have a unique perspective in terms of what we're seeing in the marketplace there. And we're going to be sharing those with you over the next few minutes. Before we get started, we've got our first polling question. And you should see the polls popping up on the right pretty soon here. And the question is, just to kind of set the stage and to see where everyone's coming from, what is your organization's biggest driver for bringing in outside support resources? Is it cost reduction? Is it skills or gaps? So you're trying to add new skills or new skills or expertise? Is it scalability of resources because you've got fluctuations in maybe your workload? Is it specific projects, one-off projects, or other? So we're going to take about 45 seconds for everyone to fill in those, and then we'll just see where everyone's at.
So, John, where do you think everyone will end up answering this question at?
I would say most of the requests we get are probably either A, cost reduction, where someone's got a very aggressive cost reduction target and they're looking to bring in outside resources to help with that, or D, project-based needs, one-off projects. We'll talk later about it. We are starting to see more companies use kind of these creative staffing models. Just scalability is kind of part of the long-term solution as well.
So you're guessing A or D, right?
That would be my guess. We'll see.
Looks like A is the winner.
Okay. Good. So we got A at 32%. Looked like B and C were kind of a close second. And then D, my other guess, was actually kind of low. So learned something new. Interesting. Okay. That's good to know. That'll we'll try to adapt some of our messages as we go through this based on that. So why don't we move on to the next section? This first section, just to set the stage, I alluded to this a little bit, but we're seeing that a lot of companies are being asked to do more with less, and so they're not necessarily having the ability to hire new resources, but either they've got more aggressive cost reduction targets, or they've got more projects that they're starting to be asked to help with, and that's what's driving, I think, this companies getting more creative, in how they add resources or need to add resources to the organization. And I think one of the things that's driving it, if you look at, for those of you following on the PDF version, page 16, I'm sure all of you probably have seen something like this, but just areas that procurement can add value to the organization. What we're seeing is, maybe 10 years ago, maybe 10% of the procurement organizations or companies really saw this full breadth of value that procurement could add, and that's increased a lot over the years. I would say now, certainly the majority of companies at the C-level see the value that procurement can add, and I think as that awareness has grown, they're asking procurement to get involved in more activities outside of just normal sourcing and just some of the standard procurement functions. Some of our clients or the procurement organizations are getting involved in M&A analysis, and, working with M&A teams. They're getting involved with sales as they're getting into new markets and trying to engage suppliers maybe in some of the new markets to help facilitate their approval and getting into those new markets with local governments and things like that. So we're seeing procurement getting involved in a lot more activities, but they're not really having the ability to add resources. So that's one of the, dimensions that we're seeing. And if you look at the full procurement life cycle of where procurement organizations add resources, from our perspective, it's very different depending on what phase of the procurement function you're at. If you look at the upfront category management phase where you're doing spend analysis and category strategy and that type of work, very few companies are outsourcing that, and we don't recommend that companies outsource that. We think that part is definitely a very strategic function. We do see companies engaging consultants or specialized expertise at that phase of the process, but just typically more one-off type projects where you need a very specialized expertise. If you get into the source to manage phase, that's where we see a lot more things happening. We see companies using staff augmentation because maybe they just need more arms and legs. We see companies starting to outsource some in that phase, if they're at least in niche areas like the tactical part of sourcing, like ERFX management and things like that. We see companies using consultants for one-off sourcing events, for example, or to maybe improve the process with that. So that middle phase is an area that we're seeing companies engage kind of the full spectrum of external support resources. And then if you look at the transactional compliance phase, that's mostly companies have been outsourcing or either externally or setting up off-site shared service, kind of low-cost shared service operations to handle the transactional phase. That's pretty commonly outsourced or handled through internal shared service organizations. But don't typically see a lot of consulting on that side of the business. It's more of an outsourcing, sometimes some staffing. So it's interesting, I think, if you look at your operation and where you might need external resources or flexible resources, I think understanding which phase of the process you're in kind of helps define what types of resources might be most useful. And then if you look at why companies are typically resource constrained, obviously there's just some companies don't have enough resources. They've got hiring freezes, or they have the inability to bring in full-time resources, so that's obviously an obvious reason. Sometimes it's just lack of special skills or specific category expertise or knowledge. Poor stakeholder compliance. If you've got stakeholders that are not using your agreements or your contracts, obviously that drives more work for the procurement organization trying to get your arms around that. So that causes some resource issues. If you don't have standardization of your work and your processes, that certainly adds to the workload and can cause the need for more resources. And then having a low or not a very formal knowledge management process can add to that as well, because then you're having to reinvent the wheel every time you go out for a new sourcing event or things like that. And then last, the data quality can certainly add to that. If you've got, if your data isn't coded correctly and things like that, that can add a lot of work to the front end in terms of spend analysis and things like that.
Hey, John.
So at this point, yeah.
Hey, we've had our first question come in. Would this be a good time to take a question?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
All right, the first question, it says, what resources do you recommend in preparation to build a category management department and prioritizing the duties?
So what resources, could you repeat that? You cut out on
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Sure, it says, what resources do you recommend in preparation to build a category management department and prioritizing the duties?
Okay. I would say we typically, if you look at the types of resources we provide for the design of the category management function and understanding the specific duties and job roles and things like that, a lot of times our consulting resource typically gets involved in that. And that's usually a fairly quick project. It's sharing how other companies organize their category management functions, what types of positions there are, the types of skill sets. Sometimes we'll work with companies to define the skill sets and then do an assessment of their current organization to see if they've got the existing skill sets in-house, and maybe there just needs to be some training if they haven't done that before. In some cases, you find that there's a big gap and development maybe isn't an option, at least if there's something you need to do very quickly. So companies will either bring in staffing resources or go out and actually hire resources for that as well.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that. Okay.
Sure. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Marrena Anderson. She's going to cover some of the background in the flexible labor space.
Thanks, John. So for those of you that are following along on PDF versions, we're on slide 19 now of the presentation. Moving on to slide 20, which is labor trends. We have quite a few labor trends that are taking place. In 2011, the leading edge of our baby boomer population turned 65. So now more baby boomers are retiring than new workers are entering the workforce. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics is predicting that the American available workforce is going to drop by 8% between 2010 and 2020. Labor shortages are affecting different industries in different ways. For example, the public utility sector is experiencing a mass retirement of skilled workers. But generally speaking, procurement organizations and industries that haven't actively sought employees from the incoming Generation Y and Z populations are going to have a more long-term workforce are going to experience some of the greatest talent shortages. As these baby boomers retire, strategic roles are being filled by the younger generations who have a need for accelerated leadership development. And the incoming generation is expected to have a high turnover rate and is going to need efficient processes for training as well as systems to capture new knowledge. Procurement teams are becoming increasingly more global, and with the onset of new and improving technologies, virtual workforces are becoming commonplace. And this is something that's highly sought after by today's workers. In our recruiting and staffing division, we find that oftentimes workers are willing to take less in monetary compensation in order to work remote or to be offered a more flexible work schedule. The virtual worker option can also be very effective in staffing because it allows companies to draw from many more potential candidates than they otherwise would if they filled their need locally. We have a couple things that are taking place in our procurement organizations. Procurement productivity and savings goals are increasing in order for companies to maintain a favorable market position, but also stakeholders have recognized the value of procurement and are engaging them much more often. So this, of course, has been a long desired result of many procurement organizations. It is taxing existing resources with additional workload. So critical to organizational success is strategic-minded talent that's adaptable to changing workforce needs, as well as flexible workforce options that can meet fluctuations in demand. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is projecting that total employment in the United States is going to rise by 20.5 million between 2010 and 2020. And this annual growth rate of 1.3% reverses that 0.2% annual rate of decline that we had occurred during the 2000 to 2010 period when we lost 3.2 million jobs. So these rapidly changing market and economic conditions are necessitating a more flexible workforce, and employers are seeking greater flexibility and efficiency. And we're not seeing organizations that reduced headcount during the recession returning to hiring employees full-time, but rather to more flexible project-based staffing models. We've noticed that more companies are, as more companies are developing contingent labor programs, not everyone's using the same terminology. So we just wanted to take a minute to define some of the terms around support options. The first of those is independent contractor. The general rule is that an individual is an independent contractor if the payer has the right to control or to direct only the result of the work and not what will be done and how it will be done. So you'll see use of independent contractors a lot more in consulting, where the consultant's been hired for a specific expertise and is more likely to govern how they'll conduct their work themselves. The earnings of a person who is working as an independent contractor are subject to self-employment tax. Temporary appointment or temporary employees and temporary appointment is an appointment lasting 1 year or less, and it's going to have a specific expiration date. Temporary employment is appropriate when an agency expects that there will be no permanent need for that employee. A temporary employee does not serve a probationary period, and they're not eligible for promotion, reassignment, or transfer to other jobs. An agency may make a temporary appointment to either meet a short-term or a project-based need or to fill positions that involve intermittent or seasonal work schedules. External consultant is someone who provides professional or expert advice. This is a professional who's employed externally either by a firm or some other agency whose expertise is provided on a temporary basis and for a fee. And as such, this type of consultant generally engages with multiple and changing clients. So this is typically viewed as a positive because they bring a wide range of experiences to each new engagement. And finally, managed services is the practice of outsourcing the day-to-day management responsibilities and functions of an operation. And often the organization providing the managed service is a service provider or managed service provider, MSP. Managed service providers are often used as a strategic method for improving and streamlining operations and cutting expenses in both the talent acquisition and procurement spaces. Today we're going to primarily talk about the use of managed services in procurement, but we'll also touch on the use of MSPs as a contingent workforce solution just before we close the presentation. So now we're on slide 22. How is contingent labor being redefined? Staffing used to be thought of as a solution to supplementing a workforce when there was a need for clerical or light industrial duties. Staffing resources would temporarily backfill roles that were created by maternity leave or a sick leave, or resources might be added to a production line when less skilled labor was needed to meet demands. The IT industry has relied heavily on staffing for a while, but their requirements are usually more general. Procurement organizations are viewing staffing much differently. Leaders are seeking skilled and degreed professionals to fill skill gaps on their teams, such as competence in a specific category or commodity, or to contribute to their organizations in a more tactical way. And this frees up their current employees to focus on more strategic initiatives. Younger generations are enjoying and even demanding change. A recent survey found that 64% of Gen Y employees intend to stay less than 2 years with their employer, and most of them are going to have 25 jobs in their lifetime. We're seeing this especially evident in the high-tech industry, where they're a little ahead of the curve in building their workforce with younger workers. So this desire for change is making consulting and contract roles very enticing to this population of worker. It's also an attractive option for those workers seeking more flexibility when virtual workforce options are allowed. So we have a complex set of variables involving in part economic conditions, population growth, and an aging population that's shaping the extent of our workforce deficit. But much of the impending labor shortage involves skills and not just the number of available workers. These skill gaps can be more quickly filled through contingent labor, and flexible labor options also carry the added benefit that we mentioned early of scalability as demand fluctuates. Our procurement organizations are being much more proactive in their approaches by developing contingent labor programs rather than the formative reactive approaches of filling a gap once the need has been presented. And lastly, we're seeing companies seeking a longer-term decision-making process before deciding to hire someone as a full-time employee. This practice makes it more difficult to seek passive talent that's gainfully employed, but it can be an appropriate option when a longer evaluation time is needed to make sure someone has the proper strategic mindset or the soft skills to properly influence. And it can also be a wise option when the long-term need isn't absolutely clear. The practice can increase worker productivity as they work to prove themselves as a valuable asset to your team. One caveat I would mention before deciding to do attempt to hire approach, if you anticipate that resources will need to work in excess of 40 hours, you may want to consider hiring a full-time salaried employee because temporary employees are paid overtime past 40 hours. Okay, we're going to move on to another polling question. Again, you're going to see the polling slide appear in the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll have about 45 seconds here for you to answer this question and have results generate. So our question is, who handles your organization's contingent labor program? Is it A, procurement, B, human resources, C, individual locations, or D, other? Again, that's A, procurement, B, human resources, C, individual locations, or D, other.
Marrena, I have to ask you, where do you think the answer will fall this time?
You know, in our client base, it really is a mix. It probably leans a little heavier toward the procurement side of operations, but we're seeing both organizations play a part in managing the contingent labor program.
Okay.
It'll be interesting to see where the results are. About 1 minute. You should see those results on your screen here in just a second. Okay, it looks like the poll's ended. Okay. Wow, we have an even split. The top two got the same percentage, about 37% each for procurement and human resources, with 9% individual locations and 15% other. So primarily, it's a mix between the two. So organizations require diverse skill sets to accomplish strategic objectives, and really procurement can be the most effective at business planning and developing appropriate supplier relationships. So we really want to drive procurement's value through the organization's commitment to talent acquisition and talent management. And engaging human resources and talent acquisition stakeholders is key to the success of any contingent labor program. Their oversight is going to be needed to support and engage the performance and effectiveness of your program, and they'll also be an important business partner to ensure programs are compliant with both state and federal regulations. Okay, I'm going to pass the ball over to John to start talking about some of our evaluating of flexible labor solutions.
Thanks, Marrena.
I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty here. Here we go.
Okay. All right, so we're going to basically just walk through the different types of options that we've been talking about and talk about the pros and cons of each and when consulting is appropriate, when staffing is appropriate, when managed services is appropriate. So I'm going to talk about the first one, consulting. And typically we see companies bring in consultants when either they're doing a major transformation and it's a fairly large project, so you need specialized expertise, maybe people that have been involved with its org design or process design or technology or whatever it is that you're are the main components of your transformation. So that might be one example. Another example of bringing in a consultant is when you have an assessment. So you need an independent third party to come in and basically give you a view of how you compare to other procurement organizations. And that may include comparing you using some special frameworks or benchmarks or data that shows, very objectively and specifically how you're comparing in terms of how you're performing. So, if you're not bringing in an outside consultant or a resource like that, sometimes it's tough to get an objective opinion of how you're doing. And then sometimes consultants are used just if you've got a very high ROI project. It could be, I know we get involved sometimes if a client has a very high spend category, and it may be something they only source once every 3 or 4 years, but it could be a $100 million category. And so the client feels that, look, we'd like to get someone on this team who has sourced, say if you're picking, say, facility services, who has sourced facility services, 4 times in the past 12 to 18 months, or, and they feel that by spending the extra cost, then it's going to be worth it. The payback you're going to get is going to more than justify that. But as Marrena mentioned earlier, it's typically very specific projects. It's in and out. It's not a long-term solution typically for consulting, and we don't recommend that. You should only bring in consultants for very specific projects where you need fast results. You need access to the best practices and intellectual capital. And also, there's sometimes a knowledge transfer component of that. Maybe you want to train your organization in how to use a new process. You want someone who's done it lots of times to come in and train, and then they leave, and then you do it all on your own. The cons to that is typically this is probably the highest cost option, consulting. So again, you want to be very targeted in how you use consultants. And in terms of a cultural perspective, I think consulting firms tend to not blend into your culture and your organization as much as some of the other options like staffing or sometimes managed services, because they're longer term, can have more of a cultural fit into an organization, almost like a add-on to your organization as opposed to consulting, which is in and out. So those are some examples of when you would use consulting and some of the advantages. Now I'll turn it over to Marrena to talk about some of the other options.
So our next option would be staff augmentation. Staff augmentation is often the most appropriate solution when procurement organizations need to fill gaps with specialized, often category-specific expertise, but they don't require access to intellectual capital or best practices. It's also a great option when procurement organizations need to shift the focus of their current employees to more strategic initiatives. They can acquire staffing resources to manage the tactical workload. This approach is usually less costly than acquiring staffing resources with specific category or commodity expertise. Staff augmentation is a great option to meet project-based needs, such as increasing your workforce to meet an aggressive savings goal or to assist with a capital expansion or facility relocation. By adding new skill sets to your team, your company can take advantage of both external and internal resources for the completion of your projects. Staff augmentation resources are more often practitioners than consultants, so they're likely to bring experience from a fewer number of companies than consultants will. And different than consulting or managed services, your procurement organization has control over the output of your staffing resources in this model. So this is beneficial when more control is needed, but considerations will need to be made internally for who will provide the staffing resources with day-to-day direction. Probably one of the greatest advantages of staff augmentation is scalability. Staff augmentation resources can easily be added or subtracted from your staff as project-based needs and workload dictates. And as we discussed earlier, companies are experiencing a complex set of variables both internally and externally. So being able to scale your staff as needed is great value. Staffing avoids the cost of investing in internal skill development, but it doesn't take away the need for procurement organizations to develop knowledge management programs as those with that institutional knowledge retire from their organizations. And my final point, staff augmentation can offer cost savings and reduced employer burdens by avoiding the cost and liabilities of direct employees. Our next model, managed services. One other way you can add resources is through managed services. Managed services options have traditionally been used for transactional procurement activities, but many companies are starting to unbundle the tactical work from strategic functions within the category management and sourcing and utilize managed services for this. Typically, these services are performed off-site, which allows access to lower-cost resources, low-cost locations and countries, and the ability to share resources across multiple clients. But generally, this is used for longer-term programs, multi-year programs, and can have a longer transition time to full productivity and may not be as relevant for shorter-term project support. Our next, and this is slide 28 for those of you following along on PDF, we're seeing organizations such as ourselves starting to offer companies hybrid solutions. And these hybrid solutions combine varying flexible labor models, tailoring an approach to meet companies' needs. For example, Denali's hybrid model combines consulting and staffing support, and we created our model in response to a need that we were seeing in our client companies for staffing resources to come not only with category expertise, but with the intellectual capital that's provided by our consulting organization. And John, you can probably talk to some of that intellectual capital.
Yeah, one of the things we found, and a lot of you have probably experienced this, if you look at a typical consulting project, there's some of the project that you really do need someone who's sourced a category multiple times, or you're looking for a new process or access to tools and templates and things that you don't typically get from a staffing firm. But a lot of the work that you're doing is really repetitive work that you don't necessarily need to pay the high price of the consultant. And this is where we're seeing, I guess, some of the shifts that companies are getting smart about how they combine the two. I guess two different things are happening. One, they're just getting smarter, and they're saying we really shouldn't be spending X dollars, on this type of project. We should be able to try to find a way to do it lower. And so we're starting to do projects now where we're bringing in a project that might have been 4 or 5 consultants. We may only have 1 consultant, and we may have 4 or 5 staff augmentation resources. And the cost of that is, as we show here, at least 30% lower. So it's a very much more cost-effective solution. And we think the clients are probably getting just as good of a result with some other benefits. They're getting access to all the intellectual capital, the tools and templates and sample RFPs and specialized expertise, things like that. But a lot of our clients have a talent shortage, and they're looking to hire. So sometimes we'll have an agreement where we can do temp to perm or temp to full-time, resources. So if they like the resources that we're providing, they can also hire them. So it can be a long-term solution. Or if it's just a short-term need, for a peak workload, they can just bring them in for a few months, and that's fine too. But what we're seeing is companies, as we talked earlier, instead of, I think historically, companies were fairly reactive when they used either consulting or staffing. If there was a one-time need, they would bring someone in. But now I think it's just becoming part of their long-term labor solution. So they're just assuming that X% of their workforce will be some type of flexible model. And, what we're noticing is that there's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not like, you're always going to have 1 or 2 consultants and staffing pool of 8 people, it's going to fluctuate from time to time. The mix is going to fluctuate. The types of skills you're going to need is going to fluctuate, which is one of the advantages of bringing in an outside firm, that you can change those up. You can bring in different skill sets as you need them, when you need them. They can go away. You can, maybe there's a core pool of temp resources that you have, this 3 or 4, but you can bring in more for really peak periods. But we're seeing this, companies just getting a lot more creative in how they're designing these programs, and they're designing them with a much longer-term view.
I'll make just a couple additional points on this before we move on. We talked about management burden and staffing. With a hybrid model, we're often providing a consultant on the ground to help with the project management, coordination, special project support, training, knowledge management, and the like. So this approach can reduce some of that management burden to help provide resources direction. And also with the knowledge retention piece, we're assisting with training both external and internal resources on combined new process and strategy. So we're helping to organize, create, and capture and distribute knowledge throughout the engagement. So that helps with knowledge retention becoming more streamlined and sustainable. Our next section, we're going to go through implementation tips on slide 29. So there's multiple flexible labor models as we've shown, and choosing the right one is dependent on your organization's size and need, but attracting the right talent is going to remain equally important throughout. So here are some questions to just consider when selecting the best partner to meet your talent needs. First, how well do they understand the procurement space? As the trend moves to implementing MSPs in the talent space, it's important to understand how well a contingent labor provider understands your space. It's difficult to identify the appropriate and best talent if you don't have an intimate knowledge of what it takes to be successful in today's procurement organizations. So a good question to ask is what processes they have in place to attract and screen talent. Next, employment laws are very fluid, so especially important in the contingent labor space is verifying that your providers have taken the proper steps to ensure that they're compliant and to mitigate any risk. How quickly will your provider understand your company culture and the needs associated with the stage, product, or service and size of your organization? Have they supported similar size organizations or similar industries? And are they able to provide references to back up their claims? Many variables go into determining the best flexible labor option, so it's important to work with providers to adequately scope your needs in advance. And it will be important to clarify what methodology, what processes, tools, and intellectual capital are available both internally and externally to resources to ensure their success. This is more critical for project-based resources who are going to have limits on their time frame for delivering results and will quickly need to access tools, templates, processes, and the like to make certain they're achieving their initiatives. We're going to touch briefly on technology. This topic could be a standalone webinar, but it is important that we address it here. A vendor management system, or VMS, is an internet-enabled, often web-based application, and it acts as a mechanism for companies to manage and procure staffing services, both temporary and, in some cases, permanent placement services. Typical features of a VMS application are going to include order distribution, consolidated billing, and significant enhancements in reporting capability that outperform manual systems and processes. We have a couple of key learnings that have been shared with us by companies who have recently implemented VMS systems and then also entered into relationships with staffing MSPs. The first is to ensure that your preferred vendors will be able to interact with your VMS provider before enlisting their services. Most contingent labor providers are going to have their own tools to track time, expenses, and performance. However, VMS systems can help consolidate these processes and make it easier for companies. Before deciding to have your VMS provider, your staffing MSP, act as the prime temporary labor agency, we suggest that you ask the following. Will they charge the subcontracting agency a percentage of the subcontracting agency's profits, which are going to make it impractical for your preferred providers to continue providing labor? This is a very common practice. And finally, determine what kind of subcontractors they'll be able to attract. Will this relationship save money in the short term, but then limit your access to the job market and cause higher turnover or slowed response rate, and produce less than satisfactory resources. So just some things to consider. John, you had some points on technology.
Yeah, one last point on the technology is, outside of the VMS system, there's also just the normal procurement technology that you're using, whether you're using any procurement system or ERFX system, whether you're using Ariba, SAP, Oracle, whatever. Some companies will bring in, if you're using a consulting firm or a managed services provider, some bundled technology with their offering. Others will use your technology, or others use both. I know from our perspective, we do both. We can bring it in, but we typically, more often than not, will use our client's technology so that it's seamless. So it's just one point. It's just as you engage a external provider, I think it's important to think up front. Are you looking for someone that can bring in some different technology, or do you not want that and want to use your own internal, and just thinking about how that's going to work with an external services provider. And then last slide, just kind of a summary. As we mentioned, the labor shortage is only going to get tougher. We're seeing that we've got clients whose procurement are losing 50% of their procurement organization in the next 5 years due to, the whole baby boomer retirement cycle that we're going through. So, we're seeing lots and lots of companies that are already feeling it in a pretty big way, and it's probably just going to get tougher. But we also see that procurement's expectations are going to continue to rise in terms of what's expected of the procurement organization. As we talked earlier about the different types of activities that you get involved with, I think as procurement organizations become more strategic, you're going to get asked to do more and more things, and it's likely that you're not going to get many, if any, additional fixed resources. And if you look at all the different ways that you can add to that out there, there really isn't one size that fits all. This concept of coming up with a hybrid solution is one that seems to be gaining traction. And when you look at it, it just makes sense. It allows you to have the best of all worlds and at a much more attractive cost. And we would encourage companies to think more flexibly or creatively about how they're going to handle their talent needs and to look at all those and not think that you've got to have one size that fits all. So with that, I'll turn it back over to John Powell. And if there are any questions, we're happy to stick around and answer those. Otherwise, thank you all for your time, and look forward to seeing you at one of the SIG events coming up.
Thank you.
Thank you, John and Marrena. Let me check. At this time, I don't have any questions in queue right this second. So that being the case, I'm actually going to give people back a few minutes back on their clock. I don't have any questions in queue, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to thank you for your presentation today. We really enjoyed it. It's something that's relevant to each and every person out there on this call. We are pushing out the slide presentation to everybody as we speak. John and Marrena's contact information is on the following slide. Let's see. It's available in the slide deck that we are pushing out to everybody. So if you have any questions or would like to follow up with them further, please reach out to them directly. They're very responsive, and they will get back with you very soon. So with that concludes today's webinar, and we do thank you very much for attending. We hope to see you at next week in Huntington Beach. Thank you.